Nice plane, ma'am. Hope that museum piece can survive modern airspace. Mocking laughter crackled through the F-16 radio as they surrounded the small aircraft that had strayed into restricted territory. But when one pilot closed in and saw the numbers on her tail clearly, his voice immediately froze. Who was she, and why did just one old number make an entire squadron fall silent? From which city in the world are you watching this today? Stay with us for real stories where quiet symbols command the skies. Captain Riley Monroe, 40 years old, was the daughter of legendary Air Force Colonel Daniel Monroe, the pilot who had saved an entire squadron during a classified operation 20 years earlier. After her father's death, Riley became a civilian pilot, spending every saving she had to restore his old aircraft, a T-38 Talon bearing tail number 73107, a number forever linked to legend among aviation circles. The restoration had taken 3 years of painstaking work. Every rivet, every wire, every control surface had been rebuilt to exact specifications for Riley. This wasn't just an aircraft restoration project. It was a way to stay connected to the father she had lost too soon when the Talon finally took flight again. Riley closed her eyes for a moment. During takeoff, she could feel every vibration of the airframe, exactly like those times her father had let her sit in the cockpit as a child to her. This wasn't just a test flight. This was a conversation with her departed father, lost in the flow of emotions and memories. She inadvertently drifted into an active military training area. The restricted airspace stretched for miles around the base, clearly marked on all aviation charts. But Riley's mind had been elsewhere the moment her aircraft appeared on radar screens. F-16 were scrambled from the nearby airbase to them. She was an unidentified threat, possibly hostile, definitely unauthorized to be in their training environment. Unidentified aircraft. You have entered restricted military airspace. Came the first radio transmission professional, but firm. Identify yourself immediately and change course. Riley's heart sank as she realized her mistake. She had been so focused on the emotional significance of the flight that she had completely lost track of her position. This is civilian aircraft, N-30 U-87T, she responded, using the civilian registration she had assigned to the restored Talon. I appear to have entered your airspace inadvertently, requesting permission to egress. Negative N3817T. You will be escorted to our facility for inspection. Military aircraft are inbound to intercept through her canopy. Riley could see the F-16s approaching fast, their sleek forms cutting through the afternoon sky with deadly precision. These were modern fighters equipped with weapons and technology that made her father's era seem like ancient history. But the T-38 Talon she was flying was no ordinary aircraft. Though designed as a trainer, it had been her father's mount during the mission that made him a legend. The same aircraft that had flown through impossible odds, dodged enemy fire and brought everyone home when others said it couldn't be done. The young F-16 pilots approaching her had no idea what they were intercepting to them. It was probably just another civilian aircraft that had wandered off course, piloted by someone who didn't understand military airspace restrictions. They couldn't know that the faded numbers on her tail represented one of the most heroic missions in Air Force history. They couldn't know that the woman at the controls was carrying on a legacy that had been earned through blood, courage, and sacrifice. As the fighters closed in, Riley maintained steady flight. Her hands confident on the controls that her father had once gripped. She was flying not just an aircraft, but a piece of living history. The radio crackled with the voices of pilots who were about to learn that some numbers carried more weight than regulations, and some legacies commanded more respect than rank subscribe. If you believe legacies never fade, even when hidden behind old tail numbers. The F-16s closed in with the confidence of modern air superiority, their pilots treating the intercept as routine training over the radio. Their casual conversation carried the arrogance of youth facing what they perceived as obsolete technology. "Nice plane, ma'am," came the mocking voice of the lead F-16 pilot. "Hope that museum piece can survive modern airspace," his wingman chimed in with obvious amusement. "Think that old trainer can keep up with real fighters? This should be entertaining." Riley felt a surge of anger rise in her chest, but she quickly suppressed it. They didn't know what they were talking about. They didn't know what this aircraft had accomplished. They didn't understand the legacy they were mocking. Dad. I'm sorry, she thought to herself, gripping the control stick tighter. The lead F-16 maneuvered closer, positioning himself to get a better look at the aircraft he was escorting. His tone became even more condescending as he keyed his radio control. This is Viper Lead. We've got some weekend warrior in an old T-38. Probably got lost trying to find the nearest airshow copy. Viper Lead escort to base for inspection treat as routine civilian violation. Riley maintained her heading and altitude, following the F-16's directions while fighting to control her emotions. These young pilots saw only an old training aircraft piloted by a civilian who had made a navigation error. They had no idea they were flying alongside a piece of aviation history in the cockpit of the lead F-16. Captain Jake Mitchell adjusted his position to maintain visual contact with the T-38. He was 26 years old, fresh from advanced fighter training, confident in his skills, and dismissive of anything that wasn't cutting-edge technology. Bet she's some rich collector showing off her toy, Mitchell transmitted to his wingman. These civilian pilots think they can handle military airspace like it's their personal playground. As he spoke, Mitchell moved his F-16 closer to get a better view of the T-38's markings. Modern military aircraft carried sophisticated identification systems, but older civilian aircraft often relied on visual identification of their registration numbers. What he saw made his blood run cold. The numbers on the tail weren't the civilian registration he expected, instead painted in faded but still readable military stencil. He could make out 731107. The familiar digits hit him like a physical blow. Every Air Force pilot knew that number. It was part of their heritage, their history, their identity as aviators at the Air Force Academy. They studied the immortal flight of 731107, a legendary case study and courage that every fighter pilot was required to memorize. Mitchell's face went pale beneath his helmet. He wasn't just looking at an aircraft. He was staring at a living page of Air Force history. His hands began to shake on the controls as the full realization hit him 20 years ago. This exact aircraft had flown into hell and brought an entire squadron home. The pilot who had been at the controls that day had become a legend, a ghost story whispered among aviators who understood what real heroism looked like. Control. Mitchell stammered into his radio, his voice cracking with shock. Hold all aggressive actions. Repeat, hold fire. We have 731,107 airborne. I repeat, the Colonel's legacy is in the sky. The radio frequency fell silent. Control towers, radar operators, and every pilot monitoring the channel suddenly understood the magnitude of what was happening. Viper 2. Mitchell's wingman moved closer to confirm what his lead pilot had seen. When the numbers came into focus on his own targeting display, his reaction was immediate and reverent. Jesus Christ, he whispered over the radio. It's really her, it's really the Colonel's bird. The entire atmosphere of the intercept changed in that instant. What had been a routine enforcement action became something approaching a religious experience. The arrogance disappeared, replaced by awe and respect for what they were witnessing. Riley, monitoring the military frequency, heard the change in their voices but didn't fully understand what was happening. She knew her father's aircraft was special, but she had never fully grasped how deeply his legacy had penetrated Air Force culture. "Ma'am," came Mitchell's voice, again completely transformed from the mocking tone of minutes earlier. Are you related to Colonel Daniel Monroe?" Riley keyed her microphone, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "He was my father." The silence that followed was louder than any jet engine in that moment, past and present, collided in the sky above a military training area. The daughter of a legend was flying her father's aircraft through airspace, defended by pilots who had grown up hearing stories of his heroism. Mitchell felt tears forming behind his helmet visor. His own father had been a crew chief on the mission that made Colonel Monroe famous. The stories he had heard growing up about the pilot who wouldn't leave anyone behind had inspired his own decision to become an Air Force officer. "Ma'am," Mitchell transmitted, his voice thick with emotion, "it's an honor to share the sky with you and the Colonel." In that moment, the arrogance of assumption met the chilling silence of undeniable truth. A faded number had spoken louder than any modern technology, reminding everyone in the sky that some things are meant to be remembered, not because they're recorded in official histories, but because they're written into the soul of an institution. We want to know what you think. Are we defined by what we build, or by the memories we fight to preserve? Type legacy. If you believe the best way to honor a legend is to continue writing their story. The radio silence that followed Riley's revelation lasted only seconds, but it felt like eternity in control towers across the region. Duty officers who had been treating this as a routine airspace violation were suddenly accessing files marked with the highest security classifications, Viper Lead Viper, to maintain current formation. But transition to escort protocol came the urgent transmission from ground control. "We are verifying identity and mission status." Colonel Sarah Martinez, the base commander, was immediately notified. She had been a young lieutenant 20 years ago when Colonel Daniel Monroe conducted Operation Guardian Thunder, the mission that had saved her squadron from certain annihilation behind enemy lines. She knew the stories weren't just military folklore. She had been there. "Get me everything we have on that aircraft," Martinez ordered her operations officer, "and patch me through to those pilots immediately. I want to speak to Monroe's daughter personally." Within minutes, classified files appeared on secure screens throughout the command center. Colonel Daniel Monroe's service record, despite heavy redaction due to the sensitive nature of his missions, painted a picture of extraordinary heroism that few pilots could match. "Mrs. Monroe." "This is Colonel Martinez, base commander," came a new voice over the radio, carrying an authority that made both F-16 pilots straighten in their seats. "Your father saved my life 20 years ago. You have full clearance to proceed on any heading you require." Riley felt tears forming in her eyes behind her flight helmet. She had spent so many years carrying her father's memory alone, working in isolation to restore his aircraft. To hear recognition from someone who had actually served with him was overwhelming. "Thank you," Colonel Riley replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I just wanted to honor his memory by getting his bird flying again." Captain Mitchell, still shaken by the recognition of the tail number, maneuvered his F-16 to fly in perfect formation alongside Riley's T-38. For the first time, he could see her clearly through the Talon's canopy. She was smaller than the legends had made her seem, focused entirely on her flying and the precious aircraft she was preserving. "Ma'am," Mitchell transmitted, his voice completely transformed from the arrogant tone of, "Minutes earlier, my father was Staff Sergeant Mike Mitchell, crew chief for the 49th Fighter Squadron. He was on the ground crew that prepped your father's aircraft for Operation Guardian Thunder." The significance of that statement hung in the air like a bridge between generations. Riley remembered her father mentioning the dedicated ground crews who had worked around the clock to keep his aircraft mission ready during the most dangerous operations of his career. "Your father was part of the team that kept my dad flying," Riley replied simply. "He was a good man." Mitchell felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Ma'am, my father always said Colonel Monroe was the pilot who proved that courage wasn't about the size of your aircraft or the power of your weapons. It was about the size of your heart and your refusal to leave anyone behind." The young pilot had grown up hearing stories about the day his father had watched Colonel Monroe take off in that very T-38, flying into impossible odds to extract a downed squadron from hostile territory. The mission had been deemed suicidal by every tactical analyst, but Monroe had insisted that no American pilot would be abandoned while he still had fuel and ammunition. "Ma'am," Mitchell continued, his voice thick with reverence, "Colonel Monroe's legacy lives in every mission we fly. We learned about Operation Guardian Thunder at the Academy, but hearing it from someone who prepped his aircraft, it was different. Personal, huh?" Colonel Martinez took over the radio communication directly. "MS Monroe, I want you to know that your father's actions that day didn't just save our squadron. They changed how the Air Force thinks about rescue operations. The Monroe Doctrine, as we call it, became the standard for no pilot left behind missions. Riley was stunned to learn that her father's actions had been codified into military doctrine. She had known he was respected, but she hadn't understood the scope of his influence on Air Force culture. I had no idea, she replied honestly. He never talked about the missions when he came home. That's because your father was a true professional. Martinez responded. He understood that heroism isn't about glory. It's about doing what's right when no one is watching, and staying humble when everyone is. The F-16 pilots began repositioning themselves into a formal escort formation, no longer intercepting, but protecting what had begun as a hostile encounter had transformed into something unprecedented. Modern fighters providing honor guard for a piece of living history. Viper 2 to base. Mitchell's wingman transmitted request permission to coordinate full ceremonial escort. This aircraft deserves proper recognition permission. Granted. Viper 2 coordinate with tower for priority routing. As the unusual formation continued across the desert sky, Riley found herself part of something larger than a simple flight. She was participating in the continuation of her father's legacy, surrounded by pilots who understood that some traditions transcended regulations and some honors were too important to be forgotten. Mrs. Monroe, Martinez transmitted as they approached the base, I'd like to invite you to land here as our guest. There are people on this base who serve with your father, and I think they'd be honored to see his aircraft flying again. Riley looked down at the base below, seeing hangars and runways that her father had once called home. I'd be honored, Colonel. Outstanding. You're cleared for priority landing on runway. 27 maintenance crews are standing by to service your aircraft if needed. As Riley began her approach to the base, Mitchell maintained formation alongside her, providing escort all the way to touchdown. Other aircraft on the ground held their positions, giving way to the T-38 that carried more history than most museums. Viper lead to tower, Mitchell transmitted as they entered the traffic pattern, escorting 731107 for landing. Please advise all ground personnel that this is Colonel Monroe's aircraft. The response from the tower carried obvious emotion. Copy. Viper lead, historic aircraft 731107. You are cleared to land. Welcome home. As Riley's T-38 touched down on the runway where her father had once operated, she allowed herself to smile. The aircraft that had been mocked as a museum piece minutes earlier was now being honored by an entire airbase through her canopy. She could see ground crews and pilots gathering to get a glimpse of the legendary aircraft. Some were old enough to remember Colonel Monroe personally, while others knew him only through the stories that had become part of the Air Force legend. The legacy her father had left behind wasn't just in the aircraft she flew, but in the culture of courage and commitment that continued to inspire new generations of pilots who understood that some things were worth preserving, not because they were ordered to, but because they were right. When Riley shut down the T-38's engines and climbed out of the cockpit, she found herself surrounded by a reception she never could have imagined. Veterans who had served with her father stood at respectful attention, while younger airmen gathered to see the aircraft they had studied in military history classes. Colonel Martinez approached, first extending her hand with obvious emotion. Miss Monroe, it's an honor to finally meet Daniel Monroe's daughter. Your father saved my life and the lives of 7 other pilots 20 years ago. Riley accepted the handshake, seeing genuine gratitude in Martinez's eyes. He never told me about specific missions. Riley replied, I knew he was respected, but I never understood the scope of what he'd done. An older man stepped forward from the crowd, his bearing unmistakably military. Despite wearing civilian clothes, ma'am. I'm retired Chief Master Sergeant Mike Mitchell, Captain Mitchell's father. I was the crew chief for your dad's aircraft during Operation Guardian Thunder. Riley looked between the older man and the young F-16 pilot who had escorted her. So this is a family tradition of service? Yes, ma'am, the elder Mitchell replied. Your father taught us that taking care of the aircraft meant Taking care of the pilot and taking care of the pilot meant everyone came home. Captain Jake Mitchell joined the conversation, still AED by the day's events. "Ma'am, I wanted to apologize for our earlier comments. We had no idea what we were intercepting." Riley studied the young pilot's face. "You were doing your job. Captain, my father would have understood that. But perhaps now you understand why some aircraft deserve special respect over the following hours." Riley found herself at the center of an impromptu reunion. Veterans shared stories about her father that she had never heard, while younger officers asked questions about the T-38's restoration and its historical significance. The base museum curator approached Riley with an unexpected request. "Miss Monroe, we'd be honored to create a permanent display about your father's service. Would you consider loaning us some of his personal effects?" Riley considered the offer carefully. "I'd be willing to share some items, but I want to keep flying this aircraft. It's what he would have wanted, absolutely." The curator agreed. Living history is always more powerful than static displays. Colonel Martinez arranged for Riley to address a group of young pilots in training. Standing in the same briefing room where her father had once received mission assignments, Riley felt the weight of continuing his legacy. "Your aircraft don't define your courage," she told them. "The pilot who flew this T-38 proved that heart matters more than horsepower and determination. Trumps technology every time the response was immediate and respectful." These young aviators understood they were hearing from someone who carried authentic military heritage. Captain Mitchell approached her after the briefing. "Ma'am, would you consider returning for our annual heritage celebration? I think the entire Air Force community would benefit from hearing these stories." Riley looked out at the flight line where her father's T-38 sat among modern fighters, no longer looking out of place, but appearing as the honored elder of the squadron. "I think I'd like that," she replied. "Dad always said that stories were only valuable if they were shared." As evening approached and Riley prepared for departure, she realized that what had begun as a personal journey to honor her father's memory had become something larger. The T-38 was no longer just a restored aircraft. It was a bridge between generations of aviators. The fated tail number 73107 had reminded an entire airbase that legends don't retire. They just wait for the right moment to inspire the next generation. 6 months later, Riley Monroe received a call that would bring her father's legacy full circle. "Miss Monroe, this is Colonel Martinez. We have a situation involving a downed pilot in hostile territory. Our modern aircraft can't reach the location due to terrain limitations, but analysis suggests an aircraft with the flight characteristics of a T-38 might be able to make the approach." Riley didn't hesitate. "Send me the coordinates, ma'am. This would be strictly voluntary. The mission parameters are challenging." Riley looked at her father's aircraft, now gleaming with fresh paint, but still bearing the legendary tail number 73107. "Colonel, some things are worth the risk." As Riley prepared for the rescue mission, she found herself surrounded by the same F-16 pilots who had once mocked her aircraft. Captain Mitchell approached her with obvious respect. "Ma'am, we'd be honored to provide escort. The Monroe Doctrine states that no pilot flies alone when lives are at stake." Looking up, Riley saw the familiar formation of F-16s preparing for takeoff. But this time, they weren't interceptors. They were guardians protecting a mission that connected past and present in the most profound way possible. The rescue was successful. Riley's T-38, with its superior agility and smaller profile, was able to land in terrain that would have been impossible for larger aircraft. Another pilot came home because someone understood that sometimes older technology, guided by courage and experience, could accomplish what modern equipment could not. As they returned to base flying through clearing desert skies, Riley reflected on how much had changed. The aircraft that had once been dismissed as obsolete was now recognized as irreplaceable. The legacy that had seemed like a burden had become a source of strength. The young pilots who had once questioned the value of older aircraft now sought opportunities to learn from the past. They had discovered that innovation without respect for tradition was incomplete, and technology without wisdom was hollow in a world obsessed with the newest and fastest. Many people had forgotten that some things gained value with age, courage, honor, and the refusal to abandon those in need. These were qualities that transcended generations and couldn't be upgraded or replaced. Riley didn't need recognition or ceremonies. She just needed to know that when lives hung in the balance, there were people ready to trust in proven values over popular trends. When her T-38 landed that evening, the faded tail number still visible on her aircraft, she was surrounded by pilots who had learned the most important lesson of military aviation. Some numbers don't just identify aircraft, they identify legends. Heroes may depart, but the sky never forgets. And sometimes all it takes to remind everyone is a set of numbers that refuse to fade. The legacy of 7317 lived on. Not in museums or history books, but in the hearts of those who understood that true service never retires. Subscribe Ironheart Stories if you believe quiet legacies still own the skies, and they always will.